Okay, good evening to everyone. Again, as always, please unmute yourselves if you wish to speak up. Um, so what we'll do tonight is hopefully we'll try to finish up chapter 2, and then we have a little bit of a vacation for Hanukkah and the winter break, and then when we come back on January, in the beginning of January, then we'll, B'ezrat Hashem, continue to chapter 3 of Yeshayahu. Okay, so just to recap the prior event, so to speak. So what we spoke about last time was Yeshayahu, in essence, describing the times of Uziyahu as being parallel to the times of Shlomo HaMelech. Shlomo HaMelech quite clearly, Chazal also pointed out, and is quite clearly indicated in the Psukim, transgressed the 3 prohibitions of a king, which are too many horses, too much gold and silver, and too many wives. And that led to his unfortunate downfall, despite all his great successes in building the Beit HaMikdash and really building the kingdom of Israel. And we know ultimately in his son's time already the kingdom was split, and from that time there was a great deterioration. The time of Uziyahu, it was in many respects a return to the glory days of Shlomo HaMelech, in the sense that, as we spoke about at length when we, especially in our introduction to Yeshayahu, that in the times of Uziyahu there was great success on all fronts. Economic fronts describes tremendous economic success. On the military fronts, Uziyahu conquered quite a bit, extended the borders of the kingdom of Yehuda all the way down south to Eilat, and also even conquered the cities of the Plishtim, the Philistines, such cities that today we know them to be as part of Israel, like Ashdod, which is a very important city, also for being a very significant port city till this day in Israel. But in the times of most of the Tanakh, and even in the times of Shlomo, the Plishtim were well established within their own cities, and even Shlomo HaMelech apparently was not able to conquer those areas. And Uziyahu is described as having ruled over the Plishtim, having built cities within the territories that were previously known to belong to the Plishtim. So tremendous success in that aspect. Also international relations, development of military technology, as we saw, again, for those times. And also another thing, if you remember, that we spoke about was that it appears that there was a certain unification with the northern kingdom of Israel. We see in the parallel to Uzziah was the king Yeravam II, who had extended Israel's border, the kingdom of Israel, the northern, because for most of the period of Tanakh, we know Israel was split up into 2 kingdoms. This was since right after Shlomo, during the time of his son Rechavam. So the first Yeravam broke off the kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, to the north. They broke up and established their own kingdom. So during this period of Uziah, it appears that there was also the northern kingdom was very successful, extending their borders up north into Syria. And it also appears that there was a certain cooperation and unity between the Uziah in the kingdom of Judah and Yerovam II in the kingdom of north. And so to speak, it seemed like Yerovam II was correcting, the sins of his predecessor, the first Yerovam, who had split off the kingdom in the times of Shlomo HaMelech's son, the northern kingdom. I'm just reminding you of things that we spoke about in our introduction to Yeshayahu. So these glory days of Uziah, what Yeshayahu is essentially saying is that this is a repeat of what happened in the time of Shlomo. That even though it seemed like everything was going so well, in essence, the 3 prohibitions of the king are being transgressed, if not on the technical level, but on the sort of the essential level, what's behind the 3 prohibitions. That's essentially what Yeshayahu is alluding to here. And ultimately, this will lead to the downfall of Uziah, just like the downfall of Shlomo came about. And we explained what's the connection. So if we go take, for example, the issue of the horses, so we explained that essentially the prohibition of having too many horses is in essence the Torah telling us what kind of army we should have, and the kind of army that we need to have is the kind of army like David HaMelech had, which is essentially a smaller regular army and a larger reserve corps, as opposed to the method of having a lot of horses, which is essentially having a very large regular army, which is what Shlomo HaMelech had. And that's what Uzziah, even though technically it doesn't mention the appearance of too many horses in the time of Uzziah, certainly is described a very, very large regular army of over 300,000 soldiers. So in essence, even though technically he might have not been having too many horses, the idea of having too many horses was being transgressed in the times of Uzziah. Next was the issue of having too many wives, and we said that essentially is a prohibition against overdoing it with the international relations and opening yourself. I mean, obviously, some international relations are necessary, but it can be done it could occur at the expense of allowing cultures and influences of other idolatrous nations to influence you. So that's what happened with Shlomo, essentially, with all the wives that he was marrying. It was essentially opening himself to other idolatrous cultures. And even though Uzziah might not have been marrying so many women, because of the extensive international relations that he held, that was being transgressed as well. And also the idea of having too much wealth, which, as we said again, too much wealth is essentially connected to the same idea of dealing with extensive international commerce, which is really the only way for a country to build up a tremendous amount of wealth through international commerce. And that was also occurring in the times of Uzziah, both through the commerce going through the traders' route in the desert, going on the one hand down south to Egypt and up north to Mesopotamia, and also through, as we'll see now, Yeshayahu alludes to quite clearly in the next section of chapter 2, through the two port cities that Uzziah built. On the one hand, Ashdod on the Mediterranean, and on the other hand, Eilat down south by what we call now the Red Sea. That was also occurring in the times of Uzziah. So again, that was the third component. And all these prohibitions essentially lead up to what's described in the Sefer Dvarim, that the king should not become haughty, should not become arrogant. And that's also described what ultimately we saw occur to Uzziah. Once he became too strong, too powerful, it led to corruption. And there are many aspects to that corruption, which Yeshayahu will detail in the coming chapters, but at least one significant one that we saw, it led to his act of going into thinking that he could replace the Kohanim, that he could go into the Beit HaMikdash and offer the Ktoret, the incense, and at that point, he became a leper, and that essentially terminated his reign. Even though he was still alive afterwards, he could no longer function as king. His son Yotam took over, and that was the beginning of the downfall. And we'll study later on what happened afterwards in the times of Yotam, and later on in the times of Uzziah's grandson, Achaz. But that was sort of the breaking point. In other words, it's sort of like when you have the roller coaster and it slows up, it reaches its high point, and then everything starts crashing down. So that's the tipping point. That's when Uzziah received his leprosy in his forehead. That's when everything started tumbling down, and that's exactly the point where Yeshayahu comes on the scene and tries to explain to everybody what went wrong. Okay, so essentially, this is the beginning of his explanation, what we saw in the beginning of chapter 2, what went wrong. So at first, he's putting a spotlight on these three prohibitions of the king. All of them went wrong in the times of Uzziah. And we'll see later on, it's not just that, but that's one of the core features of the times of Uzziah and what ultimately leads to the downfall. Okay, so what we'll do now is the last section of chapter 2, which is essentially tied to the same idea. of what Yeshayahu described till now. So let's read it inside, and then we'll try to analyze it. Again, as we're reading it, try to think along the, as you always, when we read the Tanakh, to try to break it down into sections, and also to see sort of what are the core components here that Yeshayahu is speaking about. Because on the one hand, the language of Yeshayahu is very colorful, very descriptive, very poetic. But you have to sort of get past all that also to try to figure out what are the contents and what is the message that he's trying to say. Okay, so let's see it inside now. Okay, so we are starting now from verse number 12 in chapter 2, and we'll go all the way to the end of the chapter till verse 22. So he says as follows: Ki yom l'Adonai tzvaot al kol ge'eh varam ve'al kol nisa v'shafeh. For the Lord of hosts has ready a day against all that is proud and arrogant, against all that is lofty, so that it is brought low. Okay, by the way, this is a concept that we'll see that Yeshayahu speaks quite a bit about the idea of a day, Yom LaHashem, a day of God, which is sort of like a day of reckoning. Okay, and this is a theme that will appear again in Yeshayahu also later on. This idea of a Yom LaHashem, a day of God which is approaching. So the day of God will be essentially against all that is proud and arrogant, all that is lofty. It will all be brought low. That's sort of the title for this section. Okay, and now he's going to describe all the different things, all the different lofty things that will be brought down. Okay, so let's see what he says. Ve'al kol arzei Levanon haramim v'anisaim, ve'al kol alonei habashan. Okay, against all the cedars of Lebanon, tall and stately, and all the oaks of Bashan. Ve'al kol ha'arim haramim, ve'al kol ha'gvaot hanisaot. Okay, against all the high mountains and all the lofty hills. Ve'al kol migdal gavoa, ve'al kol choma betzura. And against every soaring tower and every mighty wall. Ve'al kol oniyot Tarshish, ve'al kol schiot hachemda. Against all the ships of Tarshish and all the gallant barks. And then it says, V'shach gavhut ha'adam, v'shafel ruv manashim, v'nisgav Adonai levado bayom hahu. Then man's haughtiness shall be humbled, and the pride of man brought low. None but the Lord shall be exalted in that day. V'elilim kalil yachalof. For as for idols, they shall vanish completely. ובאו במערות צורים וממחילות עפר, מפני פחד אדוני ומהדר גאונו בקומו לארץ הארץ. And men shall enter caverns in the rock and hollows in the ground before the terror of the Lord and his dread majesty when he comes forth to overawe the earth. ביום ההוא ישליך האדם את אלילי כספו ואת אלילי זהבו אשר עשו לו להשתחוות, לחפור פירות ולטלפים. On that day, men shall fling away to the flying foxes and the bats, the idols of silver and the idols of gold, which they made for worshipping. לבוא בנקרת הצורים ובסעיפי הסלעים מפני פחד אדוני ומהדר גאונו בקומו לארץ הארץ, and they shall enter the clefts in the rocks and the crevices in the cliffs before the terror of the Lord and his dread majesty when he comes forth to overawe the earth. חידלו לכם מן האדמה אשר נשמה באפו, כי במה נחשבו. Oh, cease to glorify man who has only a breath in his nostrils, for by what does he merit esteem? Okay, very powerful words of Yeshayahu. Okay, so we read it a bit quickly, or maybe not too quickly, but does anybody want to try and break down what we read here? Maybe create some sort of division to this section in chapter 2. Again, you can skim it quickly.
Diane, may I ask you something?
Yes, please.
When Yeshayahu is speaking about the Isaiah Lebanon and the Alone Habashan, is he talking about the seed, the Sadiqim, the great people? Is he actually talking about the cedars, or is he talking about, is it a remez, an allusion to the great and mighty people, as we have it in the Kinot? You know, is he actually speaking? Because it doesn't make sense to me upon all the cedars of Lebanon. I mean, that's what they traded in, didn't they?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, you are correct to analyze that probably when Yeshayahu is speaking about the cedars of Lebanon, it's a parable for something. In other words, we see that Yeshayahu is always speaking in parables, and he's very fond of parables from nature. Like we had a few examples with the tree and the stump of the tree we had regarding with the animals, right? That we mentioned that he's speaking in parables. So I agree with you that he's speaking parables, although it's hard to imagine that when he's speaking about the cedars of the Lebanon, he's speaking about the righteous, because the whole idea of this chapter is that God will humble all the arrogant. So it's hard to imagine that the Isaiah Lebanon here is a reference to the righteous, although you're right that we find in the Piyutim of Tisha B'Av, Isaiah Lebanon V'Adirei Torah, which is referring to the great Torah scholars. But in this context, it's hard to imagine that that's the reference, at least in a simple reading of the text. Okay, but does anybody want to try to first, before we get into the actual details and the specifics, just to start to try and break down what's going on here in these verses? You know, give it some a title or two titles. How would you divide up what he said here on a more general level? Any attempts?
Well,
yeah,
it strikes me that it's a humbling of man's pride in all respects, in terms of the kind of things that that man in his sort of idolatry has started to worship. Presumably the oaks of Bashan have been sort of formed into idols, and the soaring towers and the mighty walls are all symbols of man's arrogance and aspiration to project his importance and power. And so he ends up in caves, hiding in away from pursuers, with the animals, where all his idols are proven to be worthless.
Excellent. Okay, so that's definitely an excellent analysis. On a more I don't know, technical literary level, how would you break it down into sections?
Between natural and human.
I'm sorry, between what?
Between natural scene, like all cedars, high mountains, lofty hills, all this is natural, and the soaring towers and mighty wall are humans.
Okay, you're right that these in verses 13 and 14, it seems to be referring to natural lofty things, and 15 and 16 are human creations. No, but I was referring to a more general level of the chapter. Not yet at that kind of specific level, just in terms of the structure of how he's described it. What literary device do you notice here, especially in this section? There's a certain literary device that keeps repeating itself, a poetic device, you could call it, maybe.
Everything that's lofty, everything that's high, that's full of pride.
No, but I mean in terms of the words, in terms of the actual words.
It always seems to sort of follow parallels.
Against. It's all against. You repeat.
Yes, very good. So if you look here, the words that keep repeating themselves, we're always looking for key words. It's easier to do this in Hebrew than in English, but the words that he's using are al-kol, okay? Is against all or on all. So you have the al kol ge'el varam, al kol nisa v'shafel, al kol arzei halevanon, al kol alonei habashan, al kol ha'arim, al kol ha'gvaot, al kol migdal gavoa, al kol choma betzura, al kol, al kol. In other words, it's against everything, against all. That's sort of the literary device that he's using in, I would say, from verse 12 till 16, okay? And, you know, all of it will be destroyed. And it keeps repeating, if you read it, especially in Hebrew with a certain intonation, it's very powerful. Al-kol, al-kol. And again, and from verse 17, he's sort of now describing, like as Alan said beautifully, the humbling of man, okay? From verse 17, man shall be humbled, God shall be exalted, all the idols. And essentially man has to return, you know, to the lowest place on the earth that you would run into hiding, which is the caves, the hollows in the ground that you would dig up. You end up, instead of having the idols of silver and gold, you're back in the caves with the bats, okay? And again, going into the crevices in the cliffs, again, out of fear. And then finally you have the pinnacle in verse number 22, which is okay, oh, cease to glorify man who has only a breath in his nostrils, for by what does he merit esteem? Okay, which is essentially, you know, the highlight, you know, that clearly in this time they were glorifying man rather than God. So he says, stop glorifying man. What is man? Man is nothing. All he has is a breath in his nostrils. That's it. Okay, very powerful words of Yeshayahu. There's also a very interesting insight here regarding idolatry. I think we spoke about it last time. But in essence, according to what Yeshayahu is describing, because clearly he's speaking here about idols, right? He mentions the idols several times. He mentions it here in verse number 18, Ha'elilim, right? The idols. And he says again in verse number 20, okay? The idols of silver and the idol of gold, which they made for worshiping. But according to Yeshayahu, when somebody's worshiping idolatry, who is really being worshipped? Who is really the idol that man is worshiping?
Himself.
Exactly. The idolatry is essentially not a worship of idols, but it's a worship of man himself. By the way, this idea of the, you know, we sort of have this idea of God rising above al kol migdal gavoa, right? Every soaring tower. We already have this in Tanakh from where this idea of God coming down against a tower built by man.
The Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel.
Of course, exactly. The Tower of Babel, which is essentially, again, described in Tanakh, although we know from historical context that the Tower of Babel, Babel, was an idolatrous practice where sort of man would go up to meet God, so to speak. But essentially, if you read the story of the Torah, it's about man trying to glorify himself, right? If you read in the book of Bereshit, Na'aseh lanu shem, and then what's God's response? Is irdana vere, I will come down and see the tower that man has built. Again, sort of that same description of God, man sort of thinking himself to be something by building this great tower, and then God coming down and saying, no, you're really lowly, and then humbling man. That was the sort of the same idea that we have by the Tower of Babel. Okay, so I think just in terms of the structure in the chapter, we sort of have first this very descriptive of Yeshayahu about everything will come down, everything, all the haughtiness, all the arrogance, and then really the humbling of man, which is tied in together to the idolatrous practice, because the idolatry was essentially really a belief in man's powers rather than belief in a man's powers as coming from God. Okay, now let's try to go a little bit into the specifics here. So I created a chart to try to analyze this whole idea of alcohol that he keeps repeating here. And what is it alluding to? So the chart I tried to create here is essentially comparing Yeshayahu here in chapter 2 in these verses to the Sefer Dvarim, where we have the commandments to the king, and also to the descriptions of Uziyahu in the book of Divrei Yamim. And this essentially, I think, will again demonstrate the ideas that we spoke about last time as well. So again, if you look at verse number 12 in Yeshayahu, so we have Kiyom la'Adonai tzvaot al kol ge'ev aram v'al kol nisa v'shafel. It will be a day of God on all that is lofty, all that is proud and mighty, and all that is lofty will now be, v'shafel will now be humbled. And again, we have this idea of ge'ev aram. So this seems to be a parallel to the commandment of the king in Sefer Dvarim in chapter 17 there. Levilti rum levavo mi'echav. Again, we have the idea of rum being parallel to veram. In other words, that his heart should not rise high above his brethren, and that's ulevilti sumi na mitzvah yamin u'shmol. He shall not deviate from the commandment right or left. Leman yarich yamim mamlachto v'anav b'kerb Yisrael, so that his kingdom will be able to last long with him and his children. And this idea we also have by Uziyahu, as we spoke about several times. This is in reference to Uziyahu in the book of Divrei Yamim 2, Chronicles 2, chapter 26. When he became powerful, his heart rose high, ad lashchit, until corruptions, vayim'al ba'Hashem Elohav, and he rebelled against the Lord his God, vayavoy leichal Hashem laktir al mizbach haktoret, when he entered to offer the incense in the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, so that's verse number 12. Now 13 and 14, this is what Flora asked about. What is the reference here? The al kol arzei levanon ha'ramim v'anisaim ve'al kol olanei Bashan, the great cedars of Lebanon, the great trees of the Bashan, and the hills and the high mountaintops in the hills. What is all this a reference to? So, to my understanding, this is actually a reference to idolatry. Why? Because if we look also in the book of Dvarim, I hope you can see it, it's a bit small in the front.
They have the Asherah, don't they?
Yes. This is where idolatry was practiced. Okay, if we look in the book of Dvarim, chapter 12, it says, "Abed te'abedun et kol ha'mekomot asher avdu sham hagoyim asher atem yorshim otam et Elohehem, al ha'arim haramim ve'al ha'gvaot ve'tachat kol etz ra'anan." In other words, you should destroy all the places in which the nations that you are now conquering them, all the places that they worship their gods. Where did they worship gods? Al ha'arim haramim, again on the high mountains, ve'al ha'gvaot, on the mountaintops, ve'tachat kol etz ra'anan, and under any fresh or lively tree. Okay, so there's a significant connection between what's described here, the trees and the mountaintops. It's a clear allusion to idolatry, because these are the places where the idolatry was done, on the high mountaintops and under the trees. And we actually even have several prohibitions that relate to that, because the idolatrous practice was actually to be on these mountaintops and these trees. What prohibitions do we have in the Torah to sort of combat those practices?
We mustn't cut down a fruit-bearing tree.
No, but you're right. There is a prohibition against cutting down a fruit tree, but I don't think it's connected to idolatry. That's more the idea of bal tashchit, don't put away.
Yeah.
So what prohibition do we have that essentially is connected to idolatry?
Making sculptures.
Well, right, no making sculptures, but I'm referring specifically to the mountaintops and the trees.
But they were the Asherot, the groves that they used to worship.
The Asherah was essentially a tree under which they placed their idolatries.
Yes.
So what do we have against that? What prohibition on the Torah do we have against that?
Perhaps we shouldn't worship idols.
No, but it also says specifically, Lo tita lecha ashira etzel kol mizbach Hashem Elokecha. We have a prohibition against planting a tree next to an altar, which is meant to service Hashem. That's again to distinguish from the idolatrous practices of always having the altars to the idolatry placed nearby these trees. Okay, what about mountaintops? Which mountaintops were chosen for worship? Think about the Temple Mount nowadays. 1 second. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Okay, good. It's supposed to be a secure room, but sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Think about the Temple Mount. Is it the highest mountain in the area? If you've been to Yerushalayim, you can probably, if you go into the Kotel, is it the highest hilltop in the area? No, not at all. You have, for example, right on top of it, you have the Mount of Olives, which is much, much higher up than the Temple Mount. So clearly, not the highest mountain was chosen, right? Also, even Har Sinai was not chosen because it was the most majestic mountain in the area. Specifically, lower mountains were chosen. And apparently, this was part of the contrast to the idolatrous practices of always choosing, the highest mountain in the area. Okay, and here clearly the mountains that were chosen were specifically lower mounts as opposed to the other mountains that could have been chosen. So you have in Yerushalayim, for example, you have Har HaZeitim, Har HaTzofim. You have the whole area is filled with mountains which are actually much higher than actually Har HaBayit, than the Temple Mount. Okay, so this is all against the idolatrous practice. So this, in essence, when Yeshayahu is describing God rising above all these trees and all these mountains, apparently the reference is actually to idolatry, because obviously there's nothing against. The trees are not at fault. The mountaintops are not at fault. But what man does with them, in essence, by man trying to place his altar above them, it's again part of that same pride and part of that same idolatry, which is in essence the worship of man. Okay, so this is connected to the prohibition of again, not marrying the many wives, which is essentially marriages into other idolatrous cultures, which would lead very hard astray. And as we saw, this was going on to some extent in the times of Uziyahu as well, as is indicated by the verses there that we studied of Vayitnu Amonim Minchal Uziyahu Vayelech Shemo Ad Levo Mitzrayim Ad Ki Yichzik Ad Lemala. Vayetze Shemo Ad Lemelcho Ki Yifli Le'azer Ad Chazak. Right, that he had other nations subdued to him, paying taxes to him. He became very famous, even to faraway lands. And all of this apparently came at a price of being exposed too much to other idolatrous cultures and the infiltration of that idolatry, or at least some of the idolatrous beliefs. Okay, next one we have is Al Kol Migdal Gavoa Ve'al Kol Choma Betzura. So what is this a reference to? Anybody want to take a stab? The towers and the walls, the secured walls and the soaring towers. What would be this a reference to? So I think this is a reference to the military aspects. In other words, the soaring towers, the walls, which are symbols of the power of security. So this ties into the many horses, and again to the tremendous, very large and powerful army that Uziyahu had. So all of that military might will be humbled. That's essentially what Yeshayahu is describing by the Migdal Gavoa and Al Kol Choma Betzura. And finally, in verse number Tetzayin, Al Koloniyot Tarshish, the ships that go all the way to the city of Tarshish, which were considered to be very large and powerful ships. The Al Kol Schiyot HaChemda is sort of all the beautiful items that everybody covets. In other words, these are the luxury items. So this is clearly a reference to the Kesef V'Zahav Lo Yarbeh Me'od, and in other words, the the excess of gold and silver. And Oniot Tarshish, this is what I was referring to. In other words, what Yeshayahu is describing is that these were these ships in the times of Uzziah. So this is very much connected to what I mentioned earlier, the two port cities that Uzziah built. He built Hubana et Eilot. He built up Eilat, the port city of Eilat, down by the Red Sea. And also, it says here, Vayivne Arim be'Ashdod. Okay, so he built up also Ashdod, which is a port city. So apparently Uzziah, just like Shlomo, had extensive international commerce, ships going around from Ashdod all across around Africa, coming up on the bottom of Eilat, and this was a great source of wealth to the kingdom of Judah. But on the other hand, it brought with it also a very materialistic society, and also, again, as we said, too much exposure to other cultures and infiltration of the idolatrous practices. Okay, so just
one question for you, Diane Libnat. Was it the case that in these ancient societies that they were engaged in the slave trade? I mean, you mentioned going around Africa. Did they pick up slaves on the way? Was there a lot of slavery in ancient Israel? And
I'm sure there was. You know, we know that slavery was an essential feature of all of society until about the 19th century. So I'm sure it was. We know the Torah does not prohibit slavery, but it does make efforts to limit slavery. So, for example, there's certainly a very severe limitation on slavery of other Jews, and even of slaves from other nations, which is sort of more allowed by the Torah. We see all kinds of laws that were done to try to treat them more humane. So, for example, I'll just give one quick example. We have this idea that if you take out the tooth or the eye of a slave, then he gets set free. Right? That's mentioned in the Torah. What's that about? So if we read closely, there are other indications for this in Tanakh, and this was also known to be a practice, that one of the ways they used to mark slaves in ancient societies was to actually dismember them. So they would take out an eye or some sort of other part of the body, and that's how they would brand them as slaves. So in essence, the Torah says, if you do that, then he automatically goes free, if you try to brand him as a slave in that manner. So I think generally we would say, the Torah was probably not fond of slavery, but and tried to make it more humane. But apparently, for most of human history, it was not realistic to completely abolish it. Anyway, that's my understanding. So I'm sure there was a lot of this. Certainly brought in a lot of slaves, and that's probably also part of the problem. Okay. Anyway, yeah. Somebody else want to say?
No, I just said it because it says koneh lecha eved, koneh lecha baal. If you acquire a slave, you have to acquire a master. In other words, you have to treat them like you do. I think the Torah was very much against slavery in a sense.
Yes, for sure, especially slavery amongst Jews, which, like you said,
yeah. There are
so many obligations that you have towards them. Then, okay. Anyway,
thank you.
Just to try to sum up the point, though, that Yeshayahu is making here, and to connect it to the upcoming chapters. In essence, what Yeshayahu has described is a very rich society, a very powerful society, which has become very arrogant, has forgot against God, and that leads to certain behaviors. And now what's going to be the result? Now man needs to be humbled, and humbling man means taking away, all these symbols of man's power, all that man has built up, which is essentially the idolatrous behavior of man. Now, I just want to add, and this is something we saw already a little bit of allusion to it in chapter 1, that this is not just about forgetting God. In other words, the emphasis in this chapter is clearly very much about, man believing in his own powers, forgetting about God, and then now man needs to be humbled and realize his futileness against the Lord, the mighty Lord. Okay, that's certainly what's being described here in these two sections of chapter 2. But the arrogance of man is not just about forgetting God, but it also affects man's own behavior amongst men. And that's what we saw in chapter 1, that when Yeshayahu spoke extensively about the lack of justice within society. And that's also going to be one of the major topics of Yeshayahu in the upcoming chapters, the lack of justice among society. In other words, the arrogance of man is not just that now man believes in his own powers and forgets about God, but it also, this lack of humility, this arrogance, also corrupts man's behavior towards other men, okay? And so the corruption here is on all levels. In other words, the arrogance is not just God saying, what about me? In other words, everything is perfect down on earth, but just we have a problem that we forgot about God. Actually, this arrogance of man creates a corruption within society. It creates a very unjust society. In other words, we have certain people that are enriching themselves in their own powers at the expense of others. And that's going to be a major topic of Yeshayahu in his next chapter. So that's just the point I want to emphasize, that it's not just about that all these things are really great, but we just have a problem with the relationship of God. No, all these things come at a great corruption to the behavior on all levels. And the arrogance of man is also about remembering God, but the humility and the belief of God and the humility of man is also something necessary to create a righteous society amongst people themselves. And I think that will lead us into the next chapters in Yeshayahu as well, which we will start Bezrat Hashem after Chanukah and the winter break.
Thank you.
All right, so
Very much.
Chanukah Sameach to everyone.
Thank you.
Hanukkah Sameach to you.
Hanukkah
Thank you
Sameach.
very much.
Hanukkah Sameach.